of Britain, trying to do that in a slightly different manner. So you can also see like the hashtag BOB80. It's a very important, obviously, anniversary and commemoration. Now, this talk very much falls into that category. So this is specifically about an event which happened today then, and specifically about I would probably say one of the better known engagements, which was by Ray Holmes. So I am just going to make myself disappear, and then I'll start the PowerPoint. So this is the gentleman that we are talking about. So this is Ray Holmes. He's often considered to be the guy who stopped the Buckingham Palace raider, but we'll go a little bit more in depth about that. Now, just as a very basic like introduction, a lot of the claims which happened on this day, on the 15th of September 1940, which made it such an important day. So the record number of German aircraft shot down, that later proved to be somewhat inaccurate, and that was actually only discovered on the 14th of May 1947. So Philip Noel Baker, the Labour Secretary of State for Air, was questioned by MPs in the House of Commons about the number of enemy aircraft shot down during the Battle of Britain. Now, the minister confirmed that recently opened German records showed that the RAF's claim for most of the air campaign were much higher than the losses the Luftwaffe sustained. So between 10th of July and 31st of October 1940, so these are the official dates of the battle, the RAF estimated that a total of 2,692 enemy aircraft had been destroyed. Luftwaffe records, however, showed that only 1,733 aircraft were lost. So Noel Baker stressed, and he was very right to do so, that fighter command's claims had been made in good faith, and added that the revised figures, and I quote, "nothing to diminish the achievements or to dim the glory of the men who fought so bravely against great odds." So a further examination of the German records revealed that in the fighting on this day in 1940, 15th of September, and now, of course, duly commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, the RAF celebrated a tally of 183 combat victories, but in reality, it was only 56. As I said, it was done in good faith. Overclaiming was always likely when large numbers of fighters were deployed against enemy formation. And the defending forces were unusually large on that beautiful Sunday afternoon. Now, during the course of the day, the Luftwaffe launched 2 major raids on London, but both were fiercely repulsed. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park's 11 Group, defending the capital and the southeast, was reinforced by squadrons from Sir Quinton Brand's 10th Group in the west and Trafford Leigh-Mallory's 12th Group to the north. Flying from Duxford, Cambridgeshire, Leigh-Mallory's 5 squadrons operated together as a big wing and were led by the disabled but very pugnacious Douglas Bader. Now, in the first action, 25 Dornier Do 17 bombers were escorted by 120 Messerschmitt 109s, and they were intercepted by over 250 Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires. So the Hawker Hurricane, always in the shadow of the Supermarine Spitfire, but was actually the most common RAF fighter aircraft. So 3 out of 5 fighter aircraft were Hurricanes, and they also were responsible for the majority of the German aircraft shot down. So, and then in the second raid, 114 Dorniers and Heinkel 111s, and the aircraft that you see there is in the sky. That is exactly one. Those are 3 of those Heinkel 111s. Heinkel 111, the standard German bomber. One of very few of them, very few original ones remain. One of them is luckily in the RAF Museum in London. So these were shielded by 490 Messerschmitt 109s and 110s, so the German fighter aircraft. And these were attacked by 275 RAF fighter aircraft. So, as I said, a very, very massive melee, massive fight that day. Now, outnumbered for most of the campaign, the RAF pilots enjoyed the novelty of fighting and strength, but the downside was that they got in each other's way. And claims were inadvertently duplicated in the heat of battle. By way of illustration, historian Dr. Alfred Price refers to a Dornier brought down in central London during the first German raid, and it was claimed by 9 pilots from 5 different squadrons. Now, all of the claims were allowed by their respective intelligence officers, who then dutifully passed them to 11 Group headquarters at Uxbridge. There, they were logged as 9 separate victories on Fighter Command's overall tally for the day. So Dr. Price makes the point that the RAF had neither time nor the resource to research the accuracy of the claims. Furthermore, it was left to a squadron leader and a flight lieutenant at Uxbridge to collate all of the claims submitted by 7 p.m. in the evening, so that they could be vetted and then passed to the BBC to broadcast on the 9 o'clock news. Now, obviously, this was a time also that that morale had to be kept high. So the need to accurately vet all these claims, that was probably a lesser priority. So anyway, on this this day in 1940, and as the German records also show, Fighter Command had a good day. Even though it's a lot less than was originally claimed, still 56 German aircraft shot down. That was quite impressive. But just to put that into context, there were more aircraft shot down on, for instance, the 15th and the 18th of August, and one could very easily say that August was a much more representative month for what the Battle of Britain was. In September, it was gradually moving towards the attacks on London and then the Blitz. Anyway, the RAF were convinced that on this day in 1940 that they had a great day, and that was what was presented to the country, to the Empire and the Commonwealth, and of course to the press, and also the press of the neutral but increasingly sympathetic United States. So it was very important to get the United States on board. So the propaganda aspect there, again, very important. So in addition to being popular with several RAF fighter pilots, the Dornier that fell to earth in this first raid on 15th of September has a particular connection with RAF Hendon. RAF Hendon, now the site of the Royal Air Force Museum. We know quite a lot about Hendon during the Battle of Britain, thanks to a lady called Joan Bawden. She was a 21-year-old member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force who came from Claygate in Surrey. Aircraft woman Bawden was stationed at Hendon from October 1939 to May 1941, and she kept a personal diary. She later said, "We weren't supposed to keep diaries, so it was rather naughty. Mine was a secret and had to be very careful about it." We, on the other hand, we're very grateful that she was, because as well as being well observed and entertaining, Joan's diary is an invaluable record of social history. Through its 180 plus entries, we get to know and to like a lively, independent-minded young woman experiencing the exhilaration, fear, and camaraderie of war. On the 5th of September 1940, Joan wrote, "A fighter squadron has arrived at Hendon, making it operational and consequently more alive and exciting." Hendon, which is in the northwest of London, was at the time the RAF's most famous flying station, because it was home to the hugely popular interwar air displays. And the image that you see here is of that squadron that she said that landed in Hendon. So this is number 504 squadron, and more about that in a bit. So the RAF Hendon was, as I said, a massively famous flying station. Even before it was actually an RAF station. So even in the 1910, 1911, you had the very first air shows there. And then in the interwar period, 1920s, 1930s, was the home of massively important and also high society air displays. However, by 1940, it was out of date, too small for high performance aircraft like the Spitfire or the Hurricane that you see here. And the Hurricane is in its E-pen. So this is a kind of a barrier to limit damage if an airfield gets attacked by enemy bomber aircraft. Then a bomb would well, maybe destroy one Hurricane, but it wouldn't then hit the other Hurricane. So that's what these E-pens do. Now this here is an image of how RAF Hendon looked like in the day. So this would have been early 1930s if I look at the aircraft. So very high society events, so very much in line with what you would have with Ascot. Air displays and Hendon would be where the high society of this country would go to, but also obviously also the common people. So tens of thousands of people would be lining up, waiting at the gates. Very, very impressive display. But as I said, by 1940 it was out of date. The airfield had no hard runways, just grass airstrips, and also the surrounding area was heavily built up. And nevertheless, as the battle neared its climax, it was decided to transfer number 504 County of Nottingham Squadron, so that was the image that you saw earlier, to transfer them to Hendon from its base at RAF Castletown in Scotland. Most of the squadron's Hurricanes arrived on Thursday, the 5th of September, as Joan described, and were placed under the command of 11 Group. 6 of the Hurricanes were being modified at Castletown and reached Hendon 2 days later. These aircraft were led in by, and here we go, Sergeant Ray Holmes. So this is pretty much how Ray Holmes gets into this story. So he arrived at Hendon just a little bit later than the rest of his squadron. Now, Ray Holmes was born at Wolsey in Cheshire on the 20th of August 1914. Full name, Raymond Towers Holmes. He grew up to love sports, fast cars, and eventually became a crime reporter on the Birkenhead Advertiser. His connection with flying began in September 1936 when a friend suggested he apply to join the newly formed RAF Volunteer Reserve. Now, the RAF Volunteer Reserve was in a way a part-time citizens' air force, attracting extraordinary young men from ordinary backgrounds, and it provided roughly 1/3 of fighter command's pilots for the Battle of Britain. Now, having passed the medical, Holmes became the 55th volunteer to enlist, and in February 1937, he traveled to Prestwick in Scotland to begin his flying instruction. He proved to be a good pilot, and on 18th of June 1940, he was posted to fly Hurricanes with number 504 Squadron. On the 7th of September, the squadron commenced operations with a combat patrol south of the Thames estuary. They were bounced by 5 ME-109s out of the sun, and flying officer Kenneth Wendell from Auckland, New Zealand, was shot down. He was badly burned and died the same day. On hearing the news, Joan wrote in her diary, "I'm grateful I haven't a husband or a lover as a pilot. It must be apprehension all the time. I understand now why they are so hard and self-sufficient and untender. It's the only way they can endure living the way they have to live, each time going out with so little prospect of return." So this is again an example of why this diary is so special, because it really shines a different light on the psychological impact that battle had, something which even until today is still a story which is untold, which is kind of suppressed. But the psychological impacts that a battle had during the Battle of Britain or during the Second World War, or even recent conflicts like in Afghanistan or Iraq, the impact, what we now call as PTSD, is something which these pilots carried with them for decades after they left the service. Anyway, back to September 1940, and specifically now, exactly 80 years ago, on the Sunday 15th of September. At dawn, the pilots of number 504 Squadron were at readiness. The weather was fine and clear, and enemy raids were expected, but the radar stations dotted around Britain's coastline reported nothing. So the squadron was stood down and the pilots returned to their dispersal area to await instructions. Now, Ray Holmes decided to return to the sergeant's mess to take a bath. At about the same time, the radar stations on the south coast began to pick up activity over the Pas-de-Calais, and soon a formation of bombers with a heavy fighter escort appeared on their screens. Now, back at Hendon, Sergeant Holmes was no sooner in the bath than, predictably, the telephone rang ordering the squadrons to readiness. Still soaking wet, he pulled on a blue sports shirt and his uniform trousers and ran barefoot out of the mess to the waiting Humber Snipe vehicle. By the time the car reached the dispersal area at the airfield, the squadron scramble had been ordered. So Holmes only had time to seize his life jacket, flying boots, before dashing out to his Hurricane P2725. Now, the pilots of 504 were unusual in that they scrambled to musical accompaniment. The music was always the same, the stirring finale to Rossini's William Tell Overture, which the fighter pilots understood as William Tell, Run Like Hell. At 11:23 a.m., this is exactly 80 years ago and 1 hour ago, and less than 5 minutes after the alert, the squadron was airborne. Northolt Control ordered the 12 Hurricanes to combine with those of number 257 Squadron, and the two units rendezvoused at 15,000 feet over Northwell. The wing of RAF fighters, now 20 strong, was then directed to join the air battle developing over London. And at 10 minutes past 12, so this is, I hope I'm not boring you with the whole time schedule, but this is, but it is a very special day today. So it's so 10 minutes past 12, so that is 12 minutes ago and 80 years ago exactly. The Hurricanes intercepted a formation of Dornier DOS 17 bombers of Kampfgeschwader 76 at 17,000 feet over southeast London. And the image that you see here in front of you on the screen, that is that formation of or a similar formation of those Dornier 17 bombers. Very sleek, light bombers, also called the Flying Pencil. Excited to be in his first combat, Sergeant Holmes headed straight for 3 Dorniers flying apart from the main formation, braving their return fire. He attacked the bomber on the left-hand side, pressing the gun button at a range of 400 yards. But as he approached, it sprayed oil over his windshield, temporarily blinding him. It later transpired that the Dornier was fitted with an experimental flamethrower, which had malfunctioned. Describing the combat in an interview, Holmes said, "Then, as the windscreen cleared, I suddenly found myself going straight into his tail. So I stuck my stick forward and went under him, practically grazing my head on his belly. Both of the bomber engines had stopped and it began gliding downwards. Holmes then opened fire on the second Dornier and saw a white canopy appear. Before I knew what had happened, this bloody parachute was draped over my starboard wing. There was this poor devil on his parachute hanging straight out behind me. All I could do was swing the aircraft left and then right to try to get rid of this man. Fortunately, his parachute slid off my wing and down he went." Over Hyde Park Corner, Holmes saw that the third Dornier was on fire and heading towards Buckingham Palace. What he didn't know was that the crew of the bomber had already bailed out. The Dornier had been intercepted over London by Hurricanes of number 310 Czechoslovak Squadron, and the observer Hans Goschenhofer and gunner Gustav Hubel had been killed. After ordering Ludwig Armbruster and Leo Hammermeister, the surviving crew members, to bail out, the pilot, Robert Zebe, also took to his parachute. He landed near the Oval Cricket Ground in Kennington, only to be attacked by a mob of enraged civilians, including several women wielding pokers and kitchen knives. Zebe was eventually rescued by the Home Guard, but died of his injuries the next day. He was 26. Anyway, oblivious of the German pilot's misfortune, Sergeant Holmes was determined to shoot down the Dornier. But on pressing the gun button, he discovered he had run out of ammunition. There was only one thing for it. In his own words, he said, his airplane looked so flimsy. I didn't think of it as solid and substantial. I just went on and hit it for 6. The wing of P-2725 cut through the Dornier's slender rear fuselage, nearly severing the tail section. The aircraft immediately broke up and plunged to earth. The forward fuselage landing in the forecourt of Victoria Station, and the tail section coming to rest on a rooftop in the Vauxhall Bridge Road. As it dived, 2 of the Dornier's 110-pound bombs and a canister of incendiaries broke loose and fell on Buckingham Palace nearby. One of the bombs went through the roof and landed in a bathroom in the royal apartments 2 floors below. It failed to detonate, as did the other bomb, which fell into the palace grounds. But the incendiaries started a fire in the gardens that singed the lawns. Fortunately, the king and queen were at Windsor that day. Now back to Sergeant Holmes. The controls of his Hurricane were damaged in the collision, and he was himself forced to bail out over Pimlico. He landed, minus his flying boots, in an open dustbin in a garden in High Street. Surprised and grateful to be alive, Holmes found he was being peered at by 2 young women in the neighboring garden. In true fighter boy style, he leaped the fence and kissed them both. After telephoning Hendon to say he was safe, Holmes was invited by the local Home Guard to inspect the spot on the Buckingham Palace Road where his Hurricane had plowed into the ground at over 400 miles per hour. The aircraft had made a deep hole which was filling with water. Holmes paused to pick up a fragment of his aircraft's Merlin engine as a souvenir, while a crowd of well-wishers patted him on the back. A news reporter appeared and, on discovering that Holmes was a fellow journalist, offered to send a message for him. "Tell Dad I'm okay, will you?" Holmes replied, before being led to the Orange Brewery on Pimlico Road for a restorative brandy. From the pub, he was escorted a short distance to Chelsea Barracks, where he was examined by an army doctor and then invited to the sergeant's mess for more drinks. They were joined in the mess by the commanding officer, who eyed Holmes' sports shirt and socks and asked, "Do you always fly dressed like that?" The army ordered a taxi to take Holmes back to Hendon, but before they left the barracks, he was called to the main gate, where he was told a young woman wanted to speak to him. Now, to his surprise, the woman handed him a tin of 50 cigarettes as a gift for making his aeroplane miss her baby, who had been in his pram nearby. Now, Holmes didn't think she could afford the cigarettes and politely refused, but she insisted, so he took them, thanking her for her kindness. Touched by her gesture, the young fighter pilot didn't tell her that he had been completely unaware of her baby, nor did he tell her he didn't smoke. Sergeant Holmes returned to Hendon in the taxi in the mid-afternoon, where it was discovered that in bailing out, he had chipped a shoulder bone. Despite his protest, he was grounded by the squadron medical officer. Number 504 Squadron had done remarkably well over London, claiming 5 enemy aircraft destroyed and a further 4 damaged. However, pilot officer John Gertine from Haverhill in Suffolk had been killed. He was 24 years old. Later that afternoon, 504 was again scrambled and claimed 3 more enemy aircraft for the loss of flying officer Michael Jebb. Flying officer Jebb, who was from Chester, was badly burned and would die in hospital 4 days later, aged 22, so all very young men. At 10 minutes past 4, a combat report compiled by the squadron's intelligence officer was sent to 11 Group HQ, which summarized 504's fight over central London. The only reference to Sergeant Holmes' extraordinary exploit is the line, "Sergeant Holmes bailed out and landed safely." This document is now held in the archive of the RAF Museum. Now, John Bawden recorded Pilot Officer Gertine's death in her diary. Another one of them is that John, who was large and tall and young, so very attractive. John called me pie face. When I protested, went down on his knees and called me his darling love. Ah, the wicked, pointless destroying of life. Sergeant Holmes' combat with the Dornier had taken place over Hyde Park Corner in full view of hundreds of appreciative Londoners. What was more, the action had been captured by the Pathé Newsreel Company and by several photographers, making it probably the most famous single incident of the Battle of Britain. And it's especially this image there of that Dornier without its tail plunging down to earth, which has become such an iconic image. Ray Holmes was now a celebrity. He was invited to meet the King and Queen and was interviewed by the BBC. He also received over 130 letters from a grateful public, each one of which he answered personally. The press lionized Holmes as the pilot who got the Buckingham Palace radar and presented the bombs that fell on the palace as a premeditated attack on the royal family. Just like to point out that is, of course, again, where the wartime story kind of meddles and kind of blurs the actual reality. It was very, very unlikely that Holmes had any idea that that bomber was heading towards Buckingham Palace or was going to bring it down. As he said himself, he saw the bomber in front of him. He tried to bring it down. His ammunition had finished, so he, in an instant, decided to ram it. But nevertheless, these are the kind of stories that the public loved, and it definitely had a positive impact on the morale at home. 504 Squadron battled on, and over the next 10 days, it was scrambled on 7 more occasions. On the 24th of September, RAF Hendon was bombed, and the next night, Colindale Underground Station was hit by a parachute mine. So Colindale Underground Station is actually the tube station closest to RAF Hendon. Somewhat surprisingly, Hendon tube station is further than Colindale tube station, but there we have it. So Colindale Underground Station was hit by a parachute mine, killing 13 people and injuring many more. On the 26th of September, after 3 successful weeks defending London, number 504 Squadron departed for Filton near Bristol, and thus ended RAF Hendon's existence as a Battle of Britain station. On the 17th of September 1940, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Sea Lion had always been an impossibility without Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe first winning air superiority over Southeast England. And it was clear that it was unable to do this. For historian Stephen Bungay, the Battle of Britain was won not on 15 September 1940, but in late August and the first days of September, when Fighter Command survived the Luftwaffe's onslaught against its airfields. The fighting on Battle of Britain Day was thus less important military than psychologically, because it was on that day that the Germans were served notice that the RAF was not only still in business, but remained fully capable of mounting a highly effective defense of Britain's airspace. Throughout the 16-week campaign, the Luftwaffe was also guilty of overclaiming, and its intelligence officers consistently underestimated the size of the RAF fighters force. In consequence, the appearance of Lee Mallory's big wing, 5 squadrons over London, even though it had questionable military value, had a damaging effect on the morale of the German flyers who had been assured that the RAF was down to its last 50 fighters. Furthermore, the ferocity of the RAF's attacks in defense of the capital, with pilots willing, if necessary, to ram the Dorniers and Heinkels, was deeply unsettling. Winston Churchill chose the 15th of September to visit Keith Park, the commanding officer of 11 Group HQ at Uxbridge. The Prime Minister was alive to the significance of the drama being played out in Park's state-of-the-art operations room. Would later write, the odds were great, our margin small, the stakes infinite. And thanks to Sir Hugh Dowding, the RAF's margin of victory was perhaps not as narrow as it may once have appeared. Ray Holmes survived his celebrity and survived the war, leaving the RAF as a flight lieutenant. The best blue uniform he wore had belonged to Flying Officer Michael Jebb, killed on Battle of Britain Day. It had never been worn, and Michael's parents kindly gave it to him when he was commissioned. Ray returned to journalism in Liverpool and retired at the age of 80. In 2004, a year before he passed away, his Hurricane P2725 was excavated by aviation archaeologists Chris Bennett and Steve Vizard from its resting place 12 feet below Buckingham Palace Road. On live television, Ray was presented with the control column he had last held on the afternoon on Sunday, 15th of September, 1940. The gun button on the joystick was still set to fire. Joan Bawden, she left Hendon in May 1941 to train as a photographic interpreter. She was commissioned as an officer and subsequently posted to the Middle East. Her wartime diaries were published to great acclaim as Sand in My Shoes, Coming of Age in the Second World War in 2006 when she was in her late 80s. Now, on the 10th of October 2018, so less than 2 years ago, Mrs. Ann Holmes, Ray's widow, and his daughter, Mrs. Kate Whitworth, visited the RAF Museum at Hendon, together with Squadron Leader Andy Ham, Flight Lieutenant Jill Harrison, Warrant Officer David Dundas, and Sergeant Nick Woolmer, 4 serving members of the current number 504 County of Nottingham Squadron. They had come to see the RAF Museum's replica Hurricane Gate Guardian, which had been repainted in the markings of 2725. The aircraft Ray flew for 45 minutes on Battle of Britain Day. Anne and Kate later saw the wreckage of the engine, Hurricane displayed in the museum's first 100 years gallery. Interviewed by museum staff, Anne said, "I'm very proud to be connected through Ray to 504 Squadron. The visit was amazing and moving, a day I shall never forget. Everyone was so kind, even the sun. I wish I could rewind and go through it all once more." So that is the presentation, which is very aptly on this day, the 15th of September. So Battle of Britain Day, as said already like a couple of times, it may not have been the most important day militarily speaking, but it definitely had a very large psychological impact, and none more than what happened on that event where Ray Holmes rammed that Hurricane. It kind of exemplifies the spirit, which was not only his, but that of the few, which were not really the few, because there were 2,000 fighter pilots. But again, that doesn't take anything away of that story. So that is the presentation that I have for you. But if there's anything else, then of Joe or Ro, then I would, and I'll gladly answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Very interesting stuff. And to think that that was actually all happening literally now 80 years ago today is quite, you do hear the, you glossed over, so people just say it happened like he just bailed out. But when you actually put some flavour to it and some pictures to it, it is quite incredible, really, when you think about it, to put some stuff that way as well. So thank you very much. Very interesting, I found it. To everyone as well, I had a comment come through. There's a in the most recent issue of Airmail, we did have an article. I put this in the chat box if everyone can see that. There was an article for about members' memories of the Battle of Britain, and that includes an eyewitness account from a young boy who was on the ground when Robert Zebb landed nearby in his parachute. So there's a link there to the article as well in the chat function. So if anyone wants to look at that, but Chris, I just want to thank you very much for your presentation on this very special day as well. So to bring it really back to life, really, you know, and make it really poignant to think of what was going on. And the fact that they just scrambled so quickly whenever they were needed, and the decisions that went through their minds at a moment's notice is incredible to hear as well. So, so everybody, so Chris, thank you once again. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And we look forward to, hope you have a good rest of the day. And thank you very much. Thank you.